All right, good afternoon. We'd like to welcome you to the Statewide Technical Assistance for STRTP Programs in California webinar. This is the seventh in a series of peer-to-peer leadership conversations that are part and parcel of the state's attempts to implement fully and authentically the continuum of care reforms. Today's webinar content is the integrated core practice model and its implications for STRTP and residential services providers. So we're pleased to have you with us. My name is Richard Connect. I'm the Integrated Services Advisor at the Department of Social Services. And it's my pleasure and privilege today to be sharing the microphone with Nick Ryan from Hathaway Sycamores. Nick, would you like to spend a moment introducing yourself?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, my name is Nick Ryan. I am the Assistant Vice President for Clinical Practice and Training here at Hathaway Sycamores out here in Pasadena. And I want to welcome all of you for joining us today.
All right, we are here with the support of the CCR Branch at the Department of Social Services, of course, along with the California Alliance for Child and Family Services and the Child and Family Policy Institute of California. The purpose of our STRTP webinars in 2019 is to deliver technical assistance statewide in support of STRTP programs in California to make sure that to the fullest extent possible we have access to and can effectively implement the basic organizational leadership practices in support of foster youth. The content for the webinars comes from the state's learning over the last 12 or 15 years that began with the residentially based services implementation. We have, of course, learned a lot in the last few years relative to the continuum of care reform, which are fundamentally premised in the system of care research and the wraparound outcomes the state has experienced over the last probably 25 years now. All of that has been supported by the national research on best practices in congregate care for young people in dependency and delinquency systems. So the content for these webinars is, I think, relatively empirically based. And to refresh, or if you're new to our peer-to-peer webinars, there are 10 organizational competencies that the state has identified for providers. And we have not taken these in order by intent. So today we're circling back to element number 2, the integrated core practice model implementation and how its practices may inform effectiveness in our STRTP programs. So thanks again for joining us. Nick and I have a couple of things we'd like to focus on today. It's important, we believe that there's a wide awareness for the presence of key tools that have been developed in support of not just public agencies, but of the provider community in California in support of our foster youth who are in residential care. Those tools, we believe, support effective healing of youth, family, and communities, and that the use of practice behaviors that are captured within the state's integrated core practice model are an effective strategy, and that they provide useful guidance in delivering high quality care. The integrated core practice model has a number of domains or phases or elements, if you will. And we're going to talk in particular about 2 of those today that we think are really mission critical, if you will. We'll do a deeper dive into those. So let's first spend a little bit of time orienting to the integrated core practice model. It is a document that was released by the Department of Healthcare Services and the Department of Social Services on May 18th of last year. If you have not seen it, we certainly would invite you to take a first look, and hopefully from today's call you'll have a sense about how you might more concretely apply its principles within your own STRTP service delivery continuums. It's available on the web at there's a link, I think, that we can send to you. You can also find it in the state's database of all county information notices. The date there is May 18th of last year. The ICPM defines research-based practices specific to the values, principles, and practice behaviors that form the core components of healing teams. It's a unique document in that it seeks to provide guidance in a cross-system integrated way. We'll talk more about that in a moment or two. The fundamental implications of the practice model are an attempt to support a cross-system, cross-agency, highly collaborative environment that more effectively and efficiently addresses the young people who experience a set of complex needs in our systems. Contained within the practice model is a framework that establishes the child and family team as the principal vehicle for healing. We'll talk a little bit more about that as we go forward today, and Nick's going to share an example with us from their lengthy experience with core practice at Hathaway Sycamores. The core practice model is anchored in 10 principles. If you're a wraparound experienced person or are familiar with a system of care principles, you'll see on the screen these 10 elements that form the principles which are the basis for effective practice. And these we think are pretty universal and again apply not just to social workers, clinicians, probation officers on the public side, but for those of us who work in the healing domains and the community-based organizations and in particular in STRTPs. The integrated core practice model has 6 practice elements or domains, if you will. These again are research-based and established as the fundamental framework that allows us to kind of monitor where we are as a team when we work with young people and their families. So phase 1 or element 1 is engagement. It is a process we'll talk more about in detail. It's one of the deeper dives we're going to do today. Assessment is the second, followed by service planning and delivery, a monitoring and adapting of that service plan and the interventions delivered within it. And of course, there's a high dependence on coordination of care and management of the care and services being delivered. And of course, transitional services on the back end, if you will. So those are the 6 domains. And while this is simply kind of a conceptual architecture, it can be helpful for teams working with young people, particularly in a milieu as you're thinking about the interventions your staff are making with young people in your cottages and homes, to have awareness about how this framework supports the actual interventions and whether or not those interventions are working, and how the team comes together to monitor, adjust, adapt the service plans in order to prepare for effective transition. So the more awareness there is about these phases, we think the more mindful our care practices are, and the more we can have clarity about why we do what we do on behalf of young people. The reason an integrated core practice model is important is that we know from our experience not just in California, but across the country, that getting services from different public agencies can really create obstacles and challenges for young people and their community caregivers. In the research base, we know that somewhere around 50% of young people in the child welfare system are in need of relatively intense specialty mental health services. At some point, I think the argument can be made that that number should be higher, but at the very least, about half of our kids would benefit from specialty mental health services. And most recently in California, since we began CCR, we're seeing a little gravitation towards more out-of-county placements as we seek effective healing environments, and as we come online with the new expectations for CCR. I think we're experiencing at least a temporary increase in the number of kids that are placed out of county. This number has historically been about 25%, but we're somewhere up closer to 40 now. Bottom line is an integrated core practice model is important because if we can consistently practice across the various domains that touch the lives of young people in the foster care system, we will close the gaps that currently exist in access, coordination, sharing of information, and in service delivery. As counties have implemented core practice, there are some that are, I think you could consider maybe early implementers, going back now, in some cases, many years, but 2 of our larger counties have been kind of more assertively practicing a core practice approach, from Riverside and Los Angeles, and some of their data speaks to the effectiveness of an integrated approach. And we won't belabor these statistics other than to reflect that a couple of them are strikingly positive in terms of the average, particularly the average number of child welfare services placements in Los Angeles County per youth has declined rapidly by 60% since about mid-2017, or early 2017 rather. In Riverside County, probation youth are tracked in terms of their AWOL behavior, and they've experienced a 75% reduction in AWOL behavior since their probation officers were trained in effective engagement and teaming. And they're also experiencing a significant improvement in reoffending rates. So these are just a snapshot of some of the outcomes that a couple of our larger counties have experienced since starting core practice. So let me pause there and invite Nick to talk a little bit about the Hathways experience. Nick, I'll just try to pace you here with the slides as you go forward.
Great, thank you. So I'm just going to jump in and share David's story as an example of implementing the integrated core practice model in his care. So David's story really reflects how the integrated core practice model supports permanency outcomes, and I'll highlight some of the successes and challenges that we ran up against through the process. So at the time, David was 16 years old, and he had been told early in his life by his mother that his father died. Now, David's mother lived in another state, and she struggles with her own mental health challenges, and his mother was not considered as an option to return to her, and therefore we had to search for another path to get David to a home. So we continued to support connection with a mother, and our parent partner was involved in supporting this connection as well as supporting his mother. David's mother had lied to him often, and he didn't believe that his father was dead. So being the resourceful young man that he is, he searched for his father by name on social media. And he found a man through the search on Instagram who looked a lot like him. In fact, seeing the man's picture, the physical similarity was remarkable. In fact, they could have been twins. So working with the DCFS social worker, we were able to get approval for a DNA test. And was surprised this man was actually David's father. They connected immediately, and we began coordinating travel for the father to come out to Los Angeles, which is where we are. And the father stayed at our family cottage. The family cottage is a studio apartments located on our residential campus, right next to the cottages where the youth stay, where families can stay for the weekend or even for the week to spend time with their child. Members of the child and family team included David and his family, his CASA, county caseworker, attorney, and the other professionals in our residential program. The CASA and county worker and attorney were remarkable advocates for David in court. They were able to get authorization for David to travel to his father's state to meet other family members. And later the team was able to arrange for David to stay with his father for an extended period of time in the state that the father lived in. There was a point the team became fearful that the court would require David to return to California to finish out school. And our concern was that if David had to return to California, it could potentially impact hope for David returning sooner than later. We're just concerned that it would delay the process for him to get home. Because the CASA was such an integral and incredible advocate for David, she got the idea of finding an alternative school. The school she found is an online school where David could get his assignment packets from his school of origin here in Los Angeles and send it to David in the other state and not have to return to LA to finish school. This took collaboration between the school district out here as well as the school district in David's family's state. Interesting, we received a very heartfelt letter from his stepmother speaking to her gratitude for this process and bringing the family together. David's father filed for a 388, however, with the determination to get David to permanency and this letter from his stepmother, the attorney, the CASA, and caseworker were able to convince the judge to close the case so David could remain with his father instead of returning to California. You know, the success of this case took a lot of hard work and passion of multiple systems, including those systems outside of California. So now David lives with his father and stepmother, and the permanency plan developed looked and felt like the family's plan. The integrated core practice model provided a framework in which to shape all the decision-making during this process, and using the logic model of youth-guided, family-driven, and permanency-focused really remove the crisis of the week incidents that come up. It eliminated conflicting agendas and non-intensive and non-intentional activities. So how did we get there? We can go to the next slide here, Richard. It really took an effort to get our staff trained in the core practice model in order to really have it support the process that needed to get David and other youth home. We started by really looking at what the needs were. So one of the needs was to really provide information to staff, which included what is the integrated core practice model. And we need to communicate why it's important in supporting the youth toward permanency. We also had to look at what the integrated core practice model adds to the county core practice model, and that is that it's a multi-system and cross-system collaborative model. So my story about David getting this young man home to his father in another state may not have happened, and we would have had many more barriers. And using the integrated core practice model with cross-system collaboration, I think minimized and rectified some of those challenges with the support of multiple systems, including the court, the school districts, and DCFS. So it's helpful to share these stories also with the staff, as well as inviting the staff to share their stories. It helps bring the concept to light and make it more real for them. The other need was staff needed guidance on the implementation of the integrated core practice model. The staff had the information, but they really struggled with putting it into practice. So what we did was we created a process for the training. We provided monthly trainings that followed the core practice model and child and family team process to incorporate learning. When training the staff, we set up the training to mirror the child and family team meeting process. So for example, we would check in with each participant on what's working and the successes of using the model from month to month. And we also clarified the agenda items. We ensured that each voice was heard, and we followed the trainings on the goals, and any deviations that came up away from the goals were captured on a large post-it pad, and that was followed up either individually or at the end of the meeting. So the parallel process really supported the integration of the CFT meeting process. Now, some of the challenges that we faced, the first one was scheduling. So we ended up scheduling these meetings during lunchtime and provided lunch for the training group. The other challenge that we discovered was the varying degrees of conceptualization of the integrated core practice model. Some staff were able to hold the bigger picture while others remained in the weeds. So we really had to follow up because we met monthly. We had to circle back at each meeting with a summary of what we reviewed in the previous meeting. We reviewed lessons learned and discussed challenges that staff are facing in the child and family teams, incorporating the integrated core practice model ideas. And we practiced in-group collective problem solving to address some of these concerns or challenges. In the spirit of the CFT process, we invited the staff to identify strengths. So some of the strengths they came up with was having robust participation of youth and family in the meetings. They also identified meetings happening with regularity and natural supports were increasing participation in the meetings, and there was a more solution-focused discussion, and transition planning was occurring earlier in the process. There was consistent collaboration across roles, and mental health providers were providing more services in the community than in the clinic-based care. Some of the challenges the staff identified was having multiple goals. We had, they noticed that there was inconsistent staff attendance due to conflicting schedules, and the structure of the meetings were not consistent from team to team. And decisions were being made outside of the CFT. They found there was an over-focus on behaviors. There was low accountability and follow-up, and there was some unclarity around the action plans, and team members were working in their own lanes to the point of kind of being isolated. So what we agreed on is that we needed to decide and be clear on how the agenda is created for each of the team meetings. So the creation of the agendas was created not just with the professionals, but it included the youth and the family involvement in developing those agendas. We also circulated the agenda ahead of the meeting, ensuring that the right people are invited to the meeting. So for example, if we're talking about school, we want some representation from the school to be there. Or if we're talking about the handoff of services to another provider as we head towards transition, we would want that provider at the table as well. So these training meetings were designed to really, as I said, follow the CFT process, incorporating the integrated core practice model. So it was a live hands-on learning lab to practice as a parallel process. We together as a team agreed on training topics for follow-up, and this included role clarification and teaming practices. So we provided trainings that emphasize those two areas that the team identified. The trainings included all the roles, including their supervisors, so everyone received the same information, and it can be reinforced in daily practice and supervisions. The follow-up occurred in supervision, and we agreed that we'd hold each other accountable to the practice. This really required a shift in the culture. So in other words, any team member could respectfully call out someone and redirect them back to the process if they were deviating from the model. So systems and relationships. Internally, we needed to involve some of our administrative staff to take on a coaching approach to support the teams in their process. Some of the teams tended to stay in the weeds, and they lost sight of the permanency plan. And we also learned that the need for concurrent planning was needed to occur. The teams got really excited about their plan A when it came to a transition or a permanency plan, but sadly, out of our control, some of those plans don't actually happen, or they get debunked for some reason. So having a plan B and plan C, we found to be really important. So we had to hold staff to really providing concurrent planning to support the permanency process. We also needed staff to help examine the interpretation of scope, task, and some of the inconsistencies of processes so that it was aligned and consistent across the child and family teams. Internally, we had to really develop relationships with our county stakeholders, and this includes county managers, directors, and supervisors, as they became incredible resources when the team would get stuck or needing additional support. And we also needed to develop relationships with the school districts and law enforcement, as they became an important part of the teaming process as well. So sometimes we had to call in department leaders to sit at the table and collectively problem solve with us when the teams got stuck. What we found is that one of the challenges is that often people at the table don't have that high level authority to remove barriers, or they might have limited knowledge of resources across systems. And we had to build relationships with the county employees at all levels. So this meant engagement outside of crisis. What does this look like? Well, we were pretty assertive in sharing successes with different levels of people at the county, and also sharing our data was an important part of building these relationships. They could see what we were doing and what we were working on, so they can really join our efforts, and we found success with that, rather than just reaching out to managers and supervisors when there was a problem or some kind of a barrier. We put these relationships to work prior to needing their support, and we found that sitting on the same side of the table as our contractors created a win-win for solutions. And again, I want to mention that involving school and law enforcement was really important, as that helped develop confidence in what we were doing, and they really bought into our efforts to get the child into their community and to home. Regarding the child and family teams, we see the integrated core practice model as the framework and the CFT as the vehicle. The CFT really holds to the process, and at times we had managers stepping in to address the group dynamics if we began to move out of the focus of the ICPM or the child and family team process. We can go to the next slide. So here's some data that I think you'll find important as I'm talking about our implementation of the integrated core practice model and the use of the child and family team process. So our current length of stay is at 4 months. But if we look at this chart here, we can see that there was a gradual decline over the course of several years, getting us to where we are today. So I want to point out that at the length of along the length of the chart, in the following order, these program events contributed to the reduction of the length of stay in our program. In the year 2000, we brought wraparound to our agency. If you don't know what wraparound is, it's basically very similar to CCR, where it involves the child and family team process, family finding, working towards permanency, and it provides an aftercare component to support the transition from the residential program into the home. So we brought RAP in 2000, and in 2004, we assessed that RAP and residential kids were not too dissimilar. In fact, they were pretty much the same. So we involved the DCFS director at the time and piloted the what we call ResRap. And in 2010, we implemented the RBS pilot, which Richard spoke about earlier. And then in 2015 to 16, you see there's an uptick of the length of stay. We went from 7.7 in 2014, and then 2015 we went up to 9.8 months. This was when we implemented transitional shelter care in our program, and it did cause an uptick in our length of stay as we transitioned those TSC youth to our program, our residential program. But then we started STRTP in 2017, and we saw a gradual decline in the length of stay, which was awesome. And then by 2018, RBS sunsetted. So now we can look at some of the outcomes that I want to speak a little bit more about here. So from this slide is from our 2019 Q3, which is January, February, and March length of stay dashboard. We saw a reduction of the length of stay of about 38% of the youth transition from our STRTP within that 3 to 4 month period. We did see an increasing number of discharges to home-like environments from about 15% in fiscal year 2017 to 18 to 22% in fiscal year 2018 to 19. We also saw some incidents reduce, which I think is important to highlight here. So for example, our runaway behaviors, the runaway incidents reduced and seclusions reduced in the same quarter as our length of stay reduced. This comparison is valuable as historically, we've seen runaway behavior reduce, but seclusional restraints increase. And sometimes that was because we use seclusion restraints to divert the runaway behavior. But here we see that both the behavior and the interventions have reduced. So I'm showing this comparison to reflect that both behavioral change and the length of stay improved with implementation of some of the key components, such as family search and engagement and the focus on our work towards permanency. So to support youth voice, we incorporated what we call the personal rights check-in survey. We provided this with youth. It's delivered to them on a monthly basis to random sample youth. They're surveyed using an iPad to learn how they experience the program staff and how we're helping them. So this not only created space for youth voice, but was used by management and leadership to hold a pulse on the youth's experience in our program so that we could address their concerns. This became one of our CQI activities that could be reviewed not only with managers and leadership, but with all the staff. It really helped bring home to the staff the work that they were doing. And as we'll talk later about staff satisfaction, it was really helpful to bring this data to our staff so they can see the positive effects that they were having on the work that was being done in the residential program. You can go next, Richard.
All right, Nick, thank you for that. That's compelling information. One of the questions that was just put forward by one of the attendees invited us to ponder on the data for young people that return to care. Do you have a Hathaway specific data source for that by any chance?
We do not, and that's something that we do want to implement because we think that'd be really valuable.
Yeah, great. Okay, fantastic. So let's move into kind of a little deeper dive on two elements of integrated core practice that at least conceptually today we're going to review in some detail and hopefully have a little bit of time to ponder on implications for practice. And there are one or two questions pending for Nick as well, but I want to try to dive into a couple of these. You did also hear Nick reflect that LA County had a practice model in place before the state released its integrated core practice model. And so there was some local work to reconcile communication to all partners in LA County about what that meant to have a statewide practice model now being used and whether or not it resonated and reconciled itself with the LA practice model. If you're in a county other than LA, which many of you are, of course, there are almost no other counties that have a county-specific practice model, so you don't have to worry about that challenge in your county. Engagement and transition are the bookends of effective core practice, and they are critical, of course, because they represent the pathway in and the pathway out of your particular care episode or any particular care episode. Engagement has been well researched. One of my favorite researchers on this practice of engagement is Anita Barbie and her team at the University of Kentucky, and they talk about the fact that when families are engaged and supported, that if they have a significant role in the planning and execution of their service plan, they're far more motivated to actually commit to the plan. And the implications of that, of course, are that things like denial, and resistance that we often want to assign to families and young people in care actually are significantly, measurably diminished to the extent that we have invested in authentic listening and engagement on the front end. Families are much more likely to recognize and agree with the identified problems, perceive their goals as relevant and attainable, and be satisfied with the planning and decision-making process that the team's engaged in. So the process question for us at STRTP, in STRTP services, is how do youth inform the planning and service processes in our organizations? The core practice model has a definition for engagement, and it is captured here. I would just emphasize probably the most important thing about engagement is that it's not a switch that we invite professionals or ourselves to turn on or off. Being a professional who's authentically, genuinely engaged is an always-on switch, if you will. It doesn't just happen in meetings. It's a process that we are engaged in when we're on the phone with family members and youth. It's a process we're engaged in when we're on the phone with county partners, with people in the community, obviously. Engagement is a way of being, and it's another reason why it's the very first and most critical element of the state's practice model. One of the unique things about the state's practice model is we've tried to capture within it behaviors, professional behaviors that are specific to the domains. And so the next two slides are a quick look at the actual practice behaviors contained within California's integrated core practice model. So I'll just pause for a moment and allow you to reflect on the words you're reading here and ponder for a second or two about what that might look like in your organization as a residentially based services provider. Most of you, of course, do these intuitively. Your staff members are well trained and well supervised. There's an invitation contained within these to ponder on, I think, an element of consistency or quality. It's somewhat self-evident that we can behave in a really genuine, authentic way 90% of the time, but often what other parties experience is that 10% when we're not engaging. And that's what they remember and take with them. And that's what colors the relationship, unfortunately. So there's a tremendous kind of professional pressure, if you will, but also an opportunity to really focus on consistency. Here are the other three elements of the state's behaviors specific to engagement. You heard reflected in David's story and the experience that Nick's team had at Hathaway's, that they worked hard to engage and meet the child, David in this case, and his father and his family and community at times and in locations that were convenient for them, even out of state.
Yeah, and also asking the family who they want as a part of their team and the plan was really important as well, because then we can capture some of those natural supports that may not be in our awareness at the time that the child comes to our STRTP.
Beautiful. So a quick summary then on engagement, just to emphasize, it's a critical pathway into a healing relationship. It is less about me persuading the family members to see things as I see them, and more about me persuading myself to see issues and challenges and needs from the family member's perspective. I learned years ago this short but really meaningful thought that if I can see resistance in another party as the sign of an unmet need, I'm far more likely to be able to remain engaged and understand that there's something about our relationship that needs further addressing before we can be effective on behalf of one another. So I love this idea that resistance is almost always a sign of an unmet need. Nick?
Yeah, the other thing I was going to just mention here is that when the child has a feeling of hope, then we do see the big behaviors reduce, which was reflected in the data that I showed you earlier. But we really notice a difference when children are acting up. It's because they don't have hope. And once they're connected to the family and there's a plan and they see that everyone's working on that plan with them, we see a major shift in the behaviors.
Mm-hmm. Nice. So 3 quick process questions for you. What does engagement look like for you and your organization? Are there ways to measure it in terms of your staff's professional behavior? And of course, that's an internal process as well. How we engage with peers on our same teams within an existing milieu or across a spectrum of milieus on a particular campus site. Doing everything we can to eliminate that whole us-them paradigm, fosters unity, fosters consistency for the staff and for kids, of course. All right. Second deeper dive for today has to do with transition. This is our back-end work under core practice. Sometimes we, in the healthcare services sector, we overly simplify transition planning to be discharge planning. Many of you have experienced this in your own personal experience at the dentist, at the doctor, in a hospital. I know I've had an experience a number of times of having a healthcare professional come to me a few minutes before I was leaving a particular facility or a service entity and giving me a piece of paper, and in the course of the next 15 or 30 seconds telling me, well, here's your discharge plan. Do these 2 or 3 things, and then follow up with your doctor. It's not a very effective methodology. I would just pause for a second and digress and suggest that healthcare as an industry has struggled with this. The Joint Commission for Accreditation of Healthcare Organizations, one of our accrediting bodies in the United States, has struggled for more than 4 decades to enhance the transition or discharge planning process so that care is much more effectively sustained over time. As it relates specifically to our STRTP and CCR level work, a discharge plan or a transition plan is not just a movement in or out of an STRTP. A transition might involve the assignment of a new social worker or an intensive care coordinator. It may be placement in a different county. A transition might involve moving from an STRTP to a foster home or vice versa, of course. Any change in care should be seen as a transition and should invite us to not only convene the team or to review the team's plan at least, but to ponder on implications. Are there enough supports in place to support this particular transition, even if we perceive it to be minor? A couple of quick visuals. You heard Nick talk about the handoffs, and transitions are universal. They are all around us. Every day we see evidence of transitions. My favorite transition is the one that the paper goes through in the copy machine, because it seems to always get boggled. When I need it to work best, it inevitably has a glitch. Driving your car, you're transitioning dozens of times every day. And it's the one place, again, in the healthcare services domain where we're most likely to lose our clients, our patients, or the young people that we're engaged with in the foster care system. It's at that point of transition, and that's why it's critical. Nobody loses a 4x400 relay because they're typically, nobody loses that race because they're necessarily markedly slower than the other team. Those races are won with effective handoffs of the baton. And like engagement, the core practice model for the state has some behaviors that come to us through the practice models development process. And so I've just tried to capture these here on a single slide. So it's a busy slide, but you can see some of the points of emphasis here. And I would just invite, I guess, a reflection on the idea of proactivity in recognizing that a transition plan can't be executed in the last few hours, last few days. or even the last few weeks of care in a residential setting, the transition conversation should start and be articulated, at least the need for it, as the young person's coming into care. And beginning even with that very first child and family team meeting, and in all of our conversations thereafter where we're coordinating care, we should be talking about what's the transition plan, what's the next step, so that this young person can have an effective stay with us and also translate their learning while they're with us into their next next service entity or next treatment episode, if you will. So I think we've hit on most of these points. So probably in the interest of time, I'll skip any wide articulation of these. I would focus on the far right, however, the third box. We have a tendency in publicly delivered healthcare services to assume that our responsibility is done when our case is closed or when that young person is no longer with us. And I think that's a false, it's a false paradigm, if you will. We need to adjust as an industry, a service industry, how we see that point of responsibility. And it can be a complex conversation because I realize it has implications for funding, it has implications for policy, and all sorts of things. But if we can, as professionals and as kind of human beings engaged with young people in care, remind ourselves continually that we're not going to stop being responsible for this young person until the new care service entity is fully on board and in place. We so often drop kids into a gap in between county agencies or in between providers, and those are the gaps that kids fall through and sometimes experience re-traumatization, or that we struggle to regain trust, etc. There are 4 elements that are established in research for effective transitions and care coordination. And these involve the clear and easy access to services, of course. That's a given. The one we struggle with most is probably how effective and consistent is our communication across the spectrum, so that we're in fluid, dynamic, clear conversation with all parties. Of course, we struggle with communication around the written information, so good care is effectively informed and shared based on client needs, and sometimes we get challenged by rules and regulations about what we think we can't share. And I think we need to challenge ourselves as a service industry and not necessarily being overly fearful about what information should or shouldn't be shared, and in fact challenge ourselves to share the minimum necessary, but do so in a way that effectively supports the transition. Finally, good care coordination focuses on the total healthcare needs of our young people. The process question for us to ponder on is, does our transition planning process provide these fundamental core elements, if you will? And some key questions we might ask if we were in senior leadership in an organization, be it public or private. Has our youth's referral information been received? Sometimes we make an assumption that by making the referral electronically or otherwise, that the party next responsible has got everything they need and that they're working on it. And we ought to pause in a relatively quick time frame after sending a referral and verify, confirm that the referral information has been received completely and actually is being reviewed. This will hasten the timelines in between care episodes, particularly in regards to having all the necessary health, education, or related records to not just begin the referral and screening and assessment process, but to begin care. Another good question is, has our young person been engaged by the new service provider? And this kind of relates back to one of my prior slides, where I think we need to challenge ourselves that we don't let go of young people in our care until we're absolutely certain that they have begun their new service episode. We should make no assumptions. And one of my favorite ones under CCR is, do we have a CFT scheduled, or are we aware of the current CFT schedule? Sometimes we, in the course of transitioning young people in and out of care, we forget to reconvene the team. We say to ourselves, for instance, well, we just had a child and family team meeting 3 weeks ago, and he's been at the he's been at the STRTP now, or he's been in his foster placement for 2 weeks. Well, that's 5 weeks. A lot can happen in 5 weeks, and the team should give itself permission, notwithstanding busy schedules and other demands, to ask itself at the very least, is it time for another child and family team meeting because we've just had a transition, or we're about to have a transition, and is everybody on board with that transition plan, particularly the youth and their next caregivers. There are benefits and costs to effective transitions, and I've just tried to highlight a few of those here. I'm particularly fond of the system of care research that speaks to good transitions resulting in increased school attendance. We know that our foster youth who graduate high school are far less likely to have long-term young adult adverse outcomes. And so if we can keep kids in school, of course, through effective transition work, we're going to have better outcomes. There are cost benefits or cost avoidances. Of course, we're going to spend less time associating or dealing with associated risk from flight behavior, chasing kids down, spending time with them in the emergency room, and of course the time we spend in care management fixing bad transitions results in a job frustration, if you will, a workforce frustration that can be effectively mitigated. So my experience is sometimes we can increase our own job satisfaction if we just invest in a full and complete and thoughtful team-based transition. Most importantly, we have less trauma for kids and families as we effectively transition kids. So as we summarize a little bit this afternoon, and then have time for a question or two, core practice model and our deeper dive at engagement and transition really invite us to ponder on the benefits of effective system-wide integrated practice. And we've thrown here up on this slide a few of the benefits, again, research-based, that establish from a system of care standpoint when we're partnering, when we're highly communicative, when we focus on good authentic engagement and good transition work, we experience all of these outcomes that are beneficial not just for young people in the system, but for us as professionals and the organizations we work for. So let us take a couple of questions here, and I think I've got a few. Nick, you're still with us. Who in your organization is the steward on a day-to-day basis for managing the transition from a prior provider to your facility? Can you talk a little bit more about the challenge in the tension between being in a crisis mode and a learning mode as an organization around managing those transitions?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so often we have our own facilitators in our STRTP, and the facilitator is the one who really kind of spearheads that connection with the previous provider. And then we get the information, and however the team decides is most useful to the child and the family to integrate some of what was learned from the previous experience the child and family had into our current program. That kind of helps facilitate not only the transition, but it helps reduce the need for the family to have to tell their story again to new providers. So the more that we can partner with the previous provider, that's really helpful.
Nice, thank you. Yeah. Kind of a general question, but a good one. And maybe Nick, I'll invite you to ponder on this with me a little bit. What does a good aftercare plan include? What's in a good aftercare plan from an STRTP standpoint?
Well, services is one of the important pieces of that. You know, assessing what services the child and the family needs as they move out of your STRTP, and finding providers in the child's community or the family's community is really important. But the other piece is really looking at how to begin pulling out the formal supports so that you have more of a 2080 model. We want to increase the natural supports of the child and family team from 20% to 80%, and professionals would be more at 20% participation in the child and family team. So I would say
Yeah, I love that.
The core services and increasing natural supports.
Yeah, I think that's a nice reflection. That the wraparound research is really clear, right? That if wraparound is going to be effective in the long run, you have to end that wraparound treatment episode with the natural or informal supports outnumbering the professionals. So when we discharge or transition kids out of an STRTP, we should look at that transition plan and ask ourselves, do we have informal natural supports in place to support the family and the youth in their new setting? That's fantastic, Nick. Thanks for that. Relatively simple question, I think, Nick, for you, at least at Hathaway Sycamores. Do child and family team meetings happen in the community or at your STRTP, or both?
They happen at both, and it really depends on what the family prefers. Many of our families prefer that we have the child and family team meetings at their home. It feels more comfortable and inviting for them rather than going to a campus setting. But we're flexible. We do it either way. And sometimes we meet at neutral places, so it may not be the family's home if they're not comfortable with a team of people coming into their home environment. So we'll find another place that the family agrees to.
Fantastic. Thanks for that. Okay, we've just got a moment or two left. Thank you for bearing with us. I wanted to make an invitation to you on the line as an STRTP provider. We are in need of additional expertise. If you have particular organizational expertise or competency in these two areas that are part of our 10 organizational competencies, we would love to talk to you about being a presenter on one of our webinars coming up in the second half of the year. So we're looking for organizational expertise, again, around milieus, which help build skills towards post-care in support of transition. So this invites a relatively sophisticated awareness within the milieu and the interventions that supporting not just behavioral compliance while the young person's in your care, but how do you help that young person be fully prepared for life after the STRTP, if you will. And a second area we're looking for some opportunity for a peer presenter is in implementation of evidence-based therapies within your STRTP setting. So we're looking at those clinical modalities, if you will, that you have utilized effectively and how you individualize them for a particular youth and how you thoughtfully implement them. So if you're interested in being a co-presenter or a presenter, there's lots of support at the state level for this, and we'd love to have you get together with us. You can shoot an email to myself or shoot an email back to the CCR mailbox, and they'll forward it to me there as well. Let's see. I think in the interest of time, we probably should move us on. I guess our next and final slide for the day is an invitation to join us on August 26th, when we will hear again from our partners at the Hannah Boys Center. There was such a great response to Hannah's trauma-informed care presentation, and in a particular focus on how the milieu is affected and managed within a trauma-informed way. So we're going to take some of the experiences that Hannah shared back in, I think, March or April, and they're going to really drill down on 2 or 3 of those and talk about how you implement trauma-informed care within the milieu, how you work with staff to kind of relearn, if necessary, or effectively implement And this has everything to do with your behavioral mod program, your level system. It's a wonderful opportunity to listen to Brian Farragher and Stephanie Smith and the experts at HANA who've done just a phenomenal job of modifying their milieu over the last few years. So we're looking forward to that on August 26th. We hope you'll join us through the usual registration process. With that, Nick, let me say thank you to you and to all who've attended us today. We look forward to visiting with you again in August.
All right, thank you.